Hello guys, we're starting out Unit 4, and Unit 4 is all about international or global economics. So not all of our focus is going to be on the United States anymore, and I'm going to go ahead and warn you this unit might make you happy because there's a lot less graphing, but a lot more concepts. So a lot of what we'll be doing is looking at real world stuff and seeing how it applies to economics, but also being able to interpret charts and graphs to find out what they mean and not so much manipulating them ourselves. So in order to understand global economics, we have to understand imports and exports. And so our I can statement is I can differentiate between imports and exports. And that's something that we've kind of already talked about in class as well. I'm going to give you full definitions here. So an import is over here on the left. An import is a good or service produced in another country and then we buy it. It's bought in the United States. So that's a United States perspective thing. And the opposite would be this, an export, a good or service made in the US and sold in other countries. So an example here, the US exports a lot of airplane materials, aerospace things, and things like soybeans and agriculture goods. The US imports a lot of consumer goods. So remember that in our formula for GDP, it's C plus I plus G plus X, and that X is net exports, and that net exports is exports minus imports. So exports actually count positively in our GDP. They help our GDP grow, whereas imports count negatively in our GDP because we want to export more than we import, and we'll get to that. Unfortunately, the U.S. is an import nation, so most of the goods that Americans consume were made in other countries. Now, sometimes goods are made elsewhere and then assembled in the United States, so all the parts are made other places. Like a lot of furniture, if you look underneath, like if I went in here and looked underneath my coffee table, it says made in Vietnam but assembled in the U.S. And Toyota is a good example of this. So the parts for Toyota are made in Japan, but they're imported to plants like the one in Georgetown and are put together in those plants. And so what the U.S. primarily imports is consumer goods, goods that are made for individual or family use rather than capital goods or agriculture. So you need to understand the word trade deficit because that's what we hear a lot in the news. When they're talking about trade deals and tariffs, we hear the word trade deficit all the time. And so that's when a country's imports exceed its exports. So remember our equation for net exports was exports minus imports. So if this imports is bigger, it's exceeding the exports, it's going to be a negative number. That's a deficit, a negative number. So it's calculated, sometimes it's like all of the things going in and out of America. Sometimes it's just, they just look at agriculture concerning certain types of goods. Sometimes it's concerning a service. So a lot of American companies outsource their service sales reps to different countries like India. And so sometimes when you get on the phone with a customer service rep for a product that you bought in the United States, that product was likely made elsewhere, and the customer service sales rep might live not in the United States. So it's not just goods that can be imported and exported, it's services as well. So the U.S. has a deficit with all of our major trading partners, and the biggest of those is China. And what we're going to look at in our activity in class today is our trade deficit with China. So the opposite of a trade deficit is a favorable balance of trade. So when we look at our net exports equals exports minus imports equation, if that exports is bigger, then this is going to be a positive number, and that's a favorable balance of trade. Our balance of trade is in our favor. We're exporting more, making more money for our country instead of sending our money somewhere else. And quite honestly, the U.S. doesn't have a favorable balance of trade with any of our major trading partners, but we're going to talk in class about how that's not necessarily a bad thing. So take a look at this chart and in your notes. This chart is as of 2019. I want you to, just looking at the chart, what's the first thing you notice? What's the first takeaway you take from the chart? That's number one. Number two, what is the overall trade deficit of the United States? Like, how much are we in the negative, in a sense, when we look at our net exports equation, exports minus imports? And then what are some major industries in the United States? What do we do that we are exporting that's making us a lot of money? So answer those questions, pause this video, and answer those on your notes. All right, I told you would be looking at a lot of charts and graphs. I didn't lie to you. So take a look at this one, and this one is of 2020. So again, tell me, first of all, what are we looking at? What's one thing that you can take away from this chart? And then number two, in our top 15 trading partners, which you see here, do we have a favorable balance of trade with any? So are we exporting more than importing to any of these countries? So answer that question for me, okay? And if so, tell me what country. So remember, in our equation, net exports equals exports minus imports. And remember, our GDP equation is C plus I plus G plus X. So how do exports impact our GDP? Exports are good for our GDP. It increases, it adds to our GDP. How do imports impact our GDP? They count negatively towards our GDP, so they will decrease the amount of gross domestic product in our country. And that's all.